Exploring the culture, adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about. I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Episode 23. This program is for you, the martial arts practitioner, teacher, or if you're just curious about martial arts. In today's episode, we're going to continue to explore Ben's work on the lives of Chinese martial artists. Up in front today, Guru Zhang, a Northern Shaolin master, and a southward bound tiger. The links to the original essay will be on the website and in the PDF file. I have a feeling this particular essay is going to take us a little while, so if you want some coffee or tea, this is a time to get it. We're going to be looking into some history, and it's going to open up some doorways that we'll be walking through during the time of 2015. Speaking in 2015, I have a list of things that we're going to be launching the new year off with. I'm excited. We're going to be looking at everything from Muay Thai, Krav Maga, and a few other styles that have not been presented yet in the show. Well, let's get right into Ben's essay. And he writes, Ru Zhang is one of the best-known martial artists of the Republic of China era. He is remembered today as a pioneer who helped to bring Northern Shaolin to southern China. Now, as a sidebar, for me, Ru Zhang, the picture, the image that I became acquainted with him on, is something that you might remember. This is the fella that you see in all the magazines and all the ads. He's the one standing there breaking about 3-foot-high bricks. I think it's like 12, 14 bricks. And he's also the one that the legend says he killed a horse with a single blow. His iron palm. You type up iron palm, you're going to see this man's figure. Guru Zhang. As Ben states in the essay, and I have to agree, we don't really know if he actually killed a horse with his iron palm, but we do have confirmation that the bricks he broke in the sequence of pictures was probably done. So you didn't want to be in front of that palm. Now back to the essay. Most accounts of his illustrious career start with his appearance at the First National Guoshu exam in 1928. At the conclusion of this tournament, he was awarded the title of Guoshi, the National Warrior, and came to the attention of important leaders in the Nationalist Party. They would eventually sponsor his teaching mission to the South. The real question that we should be asking is what unique set of circumstances led him to Nanjing in the fall of 1928 in the first place. Ben writes, My own personal background is not in Northern Shaolin, nor am I really qualified to speak to the specific substance of Ru Zhang's martial method or training system. However, a brief outline of his career does open a valuable window onto the rapidly evolving realm of the civilian fighting systems in the Republic of China period. Much of my own research focuses on the evolution and development of southern China's martial culture in the 19th and 20th century. Guru Zhang is a central figure in many of these discussions precisely because he crossed cultural boundaries and helped to promote and popularize different approaches to the Chinese martial arts. For those reasons alone, his career might make an interesting case study. Still, none of us are free to make our lives exactly as we wish. Guru Zhang's career was both constrained and enabled by powerful forces within Chinese society. Some of these were the direct result of the political turmoil that China experienced in the first half of the 20th century. Others were a side effect of the rapid modernization and urbanization of the state's traditional economy. Guru Zhang's story is as much about political history as it is anything else. By exploring these sometimes neglected aspects of his life and career, I hope to shed a light on the basic forces that were shaping the development of the traditional Chinese martial arts more generally. His career coincided with the period of immense change in the way the traditional fighting styles were imagined and taught. I hope that our brief discussion may help to clarify why these changes began to emerge when they did. The next heading of the essay, Creating a Tiger. Guru Zhang's life has become the subject of many legends and stories. Some of them are basically true, others are vast exaggerations. Nor did he leave a body of literature behind, as did some of his contemporaries. All of this makes documenting his life somewhat challenging. The following account will try to stick to the known facts while placing them with the proper historical context. Guru Zhang was born in 1894 in Jiangsu Province in Funing County. It doesn't appear that his family was rich, but his father did run a successful armed escort company which employed a number of local martial artists. These sorts of businesses thrived and prospered at the end of the Qing dynasty. As the government's grip on society weakened, it became increasingly dangerous for either people or goods to travel on the roads. Local highwaymen were a constant concern. One of the most common solutions that merchants employed was to hire specialized armed escort companies to accompany their caravans. In fact, by the final decades of the Qing dynasty, such firms had become one of the leading employers of martial artists. Gu's father is said to have been an expert in tan tui, springing legs, as well as the art of throwing blades. These skills were an important part of his professional reputation, though of course by this point in time most bandits and the armed escorts that dealt with them also carried modern and effective firearms. Like many martial artists of the time, Gu's father was basically illiterate. This did not make running a business any easier, and he appears to have wanted to provide his children with the benefits of at least a basic education. In 1901, Gu was sent to complete a year of primary schooling. It should be noted that Gu was the second son. He had one older brother and a younger sister. So we can probably assume that his schooling was less extensive than what his older brother might have received. In 1906, his education changed from the literary to the strictly practical. From the age of 11, Gu was instructed by his father. He was first introduced to the form Shilu Tan Tui. Unfortunately, this course of study was also fated to be short-lived. Within 2 years, his father was struck with a lingering illness that left him confined to his bed. What happened next is a little unclear, but it appears that he advised his children on their future education shortly before he died. Gu reports that his father recommended that he seek out Yan Ji-wen in Shandong to continue his martial training. Yan Ji-wen was a former colleague who had been a player in the local armed escort industry. However, Gu did not set off all at once. Instead, he stayed with his mother for another additional 2 years. This was probably in observance of the traditional mourning period. After that, he left for Nanjing, where Gu enrolled in a middle school to continue his formal education. Unfortunately, that situation does not seem to have agreed with him. 1 year later, 1911, he and a classmate, Ba Qingshang, who was also his cousin, set out for Shandong to find Great Spear Yan. At the time, Gu was likely 15 to 16 years old. It is interesting to note the timing of his career change. The Qing dynasty was overthrown in 1911 through 1912. The nation was full of revolutionary sentiments, and young men across the state felt a very powerful call to arms in this period. The martial arts, which had suffered badly in the wake of the Boxer Uprising, also began to become more popular in this period. This was especially the case of anything that could claim to be tied to Shaolin that had resisted the now discredited Qing government. Again, we don't actually have any day-to-day accounts of what Gu was thinking or feeling, yet I find it to be suggestive that it was at this specific moment that he decided to dedicate himself to the study of martial arts. Gu and Ba apparently had little trouble locating Yan Jin-wen or convincing him to teach them. At the time, he was actually running a small school, and he seems to have been happy to take on the task of instructing the son of his friend and former colleague. Guru Zhang began his training by relearning his Tan Tui sets to his new teacher's satisfaction. At that point, he was introduced to the 10 sets of Northern Shaolin, a variety of weapon forms, iron palm training, and a small golden bell Qigong. Gu stayed with his teacher for quite some time. He studied in residence in Shandong for at least 11 years. In 1922, Gu received word of his mother's death. Decorum mandated that he return to his home village and observe the proper period of mourning. At this point, Yan proclaimed that Gu's education was complete and that Guru Zhang was ready to head out into the world. The next 2 to 3 years were spent back in Jiangsu province. During this time, Guru Zhang lived with his cousin Ba and worked to hone his skills. Yet once again his career plans changed. Rather than opening a school or joining a military academy, Gu reappears in historical record in 1925. Employed as a clerk in the office of the finance minister in Guangdong province. Many of the accounts of the better-known legends of Guru Zhang's martial feats date to this period. For instance, this was when he supposedly killed a Russian warhorse with a single blow from his iron palm. Of course, the real interesting question is not whether or not Gu actually killed the horse, but what was he doing in Guangdong at all? After all, this job was pretty far from home. Nor was it what he had spent the last 13 years training to do. Why might a resident of Jiangsu, located in northern China more generally, decide to move to a very different cultural and geographical climate in the late 1924 or 25 period? Gu did not leave us with a diary of his day-to-day thought, but one suspect that the very destructive Second Zili Fengqiang War of 1924 may have had something to do with this decision. This conflict pitted the more liberal, Western-backed Zili faction against the conservative, Japanese-backed Fengqiang clique for control of Shanghai. This included Shanghai's both rich, legal, and illegal trade networks. Things quickly escalated from there, and the conflict became the bloodiest of North China's many warlord conflicts. Almost all major urban areas in northern China suffered some damage as a result of this war, and in many of these areas the destruction was extensive. It is not a surprise to discover that a number of individuals decided that Guangdong looked pretty good in 1924 to 1925. The Soviet-backed clique of the KMT, which was headed by Chiang Kai-shek, was enjoying a moment of peace and security as its northern rivals ripped themselves apart. It is likely that Gu believed that Guangdong was a good place to start fresh. While it is a smaller port than Shanghai, the area was still connected to international trade. Even if the pace of social reform and economic growth was generally a little slower in Guangdong, by the 1920s it should have been possible to build a new life here. Unfortunately, Gu arrived just in time for another catastrophe. This was one of an economic nature. The Hong Kong strike of 1925-1926 was one of the most economically disruptive periods in the entire history of the Republic of China. Not surprisingly, this event had an important impact on a number of regional martial art organizations. In fact, it affected pretty much everything in the local economy and society. Yet it is seemingly never remembered in our discussions of the era's martial arts. The origins of this trade embargo actually can be found in Shanghai and the aftermath of the Second Chile-Fengtian War. Resentment of foreign interference was running high after this destructive conflict. Shanghai, which had both a substantial foreign presence as well as a highly unionized workforce, became the epicenter of the growing resentment. The Communist Party sensed an opening and moved quickly to educate workers, draw up lists of demands, and organize student protests. Initially, much of this agitation focused on Japanese-owned spinning mills. A series of escalatory confrontations at one mill led to a Japanese manager shooting and killing a demonstrator. At that point, the city exploded like a powder keg. Large groups began to protest in the international settlement. Demands ranged anywhere from a release of protesters held by the police to the end extraterritoriality and even foreign investment in China. Extraterritoriality is something I went to look up, and it means the exemption of the application of local law. Eventually, large numbers of protesters attempted to storm a British police station, which resulted in British, Chinese, and Pakistani law enforcement officers opening fire on the crowd. The crowd had been intent on freeing some of the jailed comrades. There were dozens of casualties. Within days, similar massacres played out in different cities around the country. Very quickly, the anger of the Chinese people shifted from the Japanese to the British. Hong Kong remained a center of the UK's commercial strength in the region, and it was a highly identifiable target. Both the KMT and the Communists initially supported plans to boycott foreign good and trade with Hong Kong. Businesses that flaunted the boycott found themselves the target of often violent reprisals. The social effect of all this was devastating. The economies of Guangzhou and Hong Kong were deeply linked and highly dependent upon trade. When that trade was severed, the entire area suffered a massive and immediate drop in GDP. This in turn led to a collapse in employment and government revenue. Probably 50% of the region's GDP evaporated in a few months. Ben continues, in a future post, I plan on talking about how these events affected the Choli-Foot, Hung Gar, and Wing Chun communities. But for right now, let's consider what this probably did to Guru Zhang. The entire reason that he had moved to the south was probably to get away from exactly this sort of social disruption. Further, he got a job as a low-level clerk, probably because he had the benefit of a few years of formal education and there was not much else for a wandering martial artist to do. After all, the military had long been professionalized, and the armed escort companies had been put out of business by cheap and reliable train travel about a decade earlier. The military had traditionally been the largest employer of the martial artists, and the armed escort companies the second largest employer of hand combat professionals. In short, the martial art world of his father and teacher had ceased to exist. Guru Zhang was probably working as a filing clerk because he needed the job. This was the basic situation before the local economy took a massive hit. One wonders whether rumors of his kung fu prowess began to emerge during this period because he was forced to fall back on his martial arts skills and public demonstrations to support himself. After all, the famous story of him killing the horse with a single punch is at the end of the day a pretty typical example of a public performance where organizers are selling tickets and contestants are competing for money. Fortunately, Guru Zhang's luck begins to improve at about this point in our story. Once again, it is a shift in national politics that opens a new set of possibilities. With the major northern clique left blooded and exhausted from their recent confrontation, Chiang Kai-shek lost little time in exploiting his opening. Following the end of the Hong Kong strike in 1926, his forces began the now famous Northern Expedition. This campaign allowed the general to consolidate large parts of China under his direct control. Still, there is more to unifying a nation than seizing territory. The KMT created multiple programs to promote a sense of nationalism and shared identity. One of the more interesting of these sought to use the traditional martial arts as a tool of state building. This was done by building off of the earlier success of the Jingwu Association. In the 1920s, there was very little about Chinese martial arts that was actually unified or modern, let alone supportive of the KMT. The Japanese had demonstrated that martial arts could be a critical part of the national building process, but to do this, the government must first assert regulatory and ideological control over this section of civil society. In politics, a message that cannot be scripted or guided is not a tool. It's a liability. The Central Guashu Institute was the new organization meant to unify the martial arts community behind the aims of the state. The group was founded as the dust was still settling from the Northern Expedition, and its headquarters were located in Nanjing. Guru Zhang appears to have hired on as a drill instructor at the Central Guashu Institute after its creation. However, that is not where he would come to national prominence. Members of the Guashu Institute realized that they needed to convince martial artists around the country to participate in their program if they were going to succeed. To spread their mission, they organized the first National Guashu exam in October of 1928. The novel undertaking was a three-way combination of a Qing-era military exam without the traditional emphasis on archery. It also had a boxing tournament and a modern, spectator-centered sporting event. The relatively young Guru Zhang entered the tournament and on his final day was named a Guashi, or national warrior. At this time, it was the highest honor that the KMT could award to any martial artist. Let me get a little water here. The next heading, the Southbound Tiger. The organization of the initial national exam had been rushed. There were the sorts of problems with the format and programming that one might expect from a new effort. Still, many members of the audience found the entire thing enthralling. One of the most enthusiastic converts to the new Guashu program was General Li Qixin. At the time, he was the governor of Guangdong and Guangxi and the commander of the 8th Army. Li decided that he would enthusiastically support the Guashu initiative. It seemed to be the ideal way to strengthen and unify the area under his command. Of course, the traditionally hierarchic structure of martial arts associations could also be converted into an inexpensive mechanism for spreading one's political influence throughout society. Li invited Guru Zhang and 4 other individuals to return with him to Guangdong, where they would establish the Longguang Guashu Institute. Collectively, these individuals became known in the press as the 5 Southbound Tigers. Together, they had an impressive background in the northern arts, including Tai Chi, Bakwa, Liu Hie Quan, Cha Quan, a wide variety of weapons, and, of course, Northern Shaolin. This was not actually the first time that the northern arts were to be publicly taught in the South. That honor is usually awarded to the Jingwu Institute, which had opened multiple clubs in the arena in 1920 and 1921. It should also be remembered that unlike most other areas in the country, the Jingwu Association in Guangdong remained strong until the Japanese invasion in 1938. Unlike the Jingwu Association, the new institute was conscious of the need to recruit some Southern stylists for the teaching staff. This went a long, long way to not alienating the local population. It hired Zhang, a white eyebrow expert, among a handful of others. Guru Zhang himself was well known for cultivating a positive relationship with the local Cholifut clan. Still, the vast majority of the organization's teaching efforts were to focus on the orthodox, aka Northern, Guashu curriculum. General Li's branch of Guashu Institute formally began accepting students in March of 1929. It had an initial enrollment of a little under 150 students, and it offered classes 5 times a day, 3 2-hour sessions and 2 1-hour slots. Following the lead of the Jingwu Association, the new club made deals with local schools, government offices, and companies to provide in-house instruction for a set fee. For the most part, it seemed to have been government agencies that took them up on the offer. It appears that a very large percentage of their student base were workers from various KMT-controlled offices. Initially, enrollment was limited to men, but special classes for women were eventually created. While enrollments were good, they were not spectacular. The fact that so many of the new students were employees of the KMT leads one to suspect that it was going to take the new organization a while to penetrate deeply into the already crowded local market for martial arts instruction. Despite these shortcomings, or maybe because of them, the governor and the Liangguang Martial Arts Institute announced a roadmap to radically reform the martial arts of southern China. The first stage of this process was the registration of all martial arts schools in Guangdong and Guangxi. The next step was to be a total ban on the creation of any new schools or associations other than those created by the staff of the Guashu Institute. Lastly, the organization would begin publication of a new martial arts magazine explicitly dedicated to advancing the nationalist Guashu philosophy. With the full power of the provincial government and the Eighth Army backing the orders, it seems at least possible that these policies could actually have been implemented. Clearly, General Li Qixin was quite sincere in his desire to turn the local martial arts community into a tool to be exploited by the state. With perfect hindsight, it is hard to see how the execution of such a plan could have anything but disaster for Guangdong's flourishing indigenous martial arts community. Political calamity intervened before the implementation of the new policies could begin. In May of 1929, General Li Qixin resigned as the governor and traveled to Nanjing with the intention of mediating a dispute between Chiang Kai-shek and the new Guangxi clique. Negotiations between the groups went badly, and Li Qixin was arrested and held until his eventual release in 1931. General Chen Chi-tong was then appointed the new governor of Guangdong and Guangxi. One of Chen's first acts was to eliminate his predecessor's cherished Guashu program. I suspect that this action was politically motivated. Perhaps he saw the organization as a threat, or maybe he did not want to align himself with a wing of the GMD that was so much under the influence of Chiang Kai-shek's vocal supporters. Whatever the reason, Chen claimed to be acting out of an urgent need for financial responsibility. The total budget of the institute was around 4,500 yuan a month. This was a substantial figure, but probably in line with the cost of a major social engineering project like that which Li had envisioned. The Liangguang Guashu Institute folded after a mere 2 months of operations, a victim of internal politics within the GMD. The upshot of this rapid fall was that a number of prominent northern expats were left unemployed and more or less stranded in southern China. This setback created new opportunities that spread the Northern arts more effectively than anything the Guoshu Institute had ever managed to do. After all, most of the instruction that the school had offered was focused on a handful of civil servants. This likely reflects the fact that it was government pressure and subsidization that supported the original institute, not public demand. Qian's forced dissolution of the institute allowed its instructors to enter the much broader marketplace for private instruction. It was within these smaller commercial schools that northern styles such as Bak Xiao Lam and Tai Chi really took hold and began to spread in the south. Guru Zhang proved to be among the most influential of the remaining staff. In June of 1929, he created Guoshu Institute. It seems like that this new, smaller organization had some level of official backing and that it clearly fell within the broader Guoshu movement led by the Central Academy in Nanjing. The group was housed in the building of the National Athletic Association. The institute did not continue the grandiose mission of its predecessor. It did not attempt to regulate or lead the local martial arts marketplace. It essentially became just one more of the martial arts schools among many. Ironically, that appears to have been the key to its long-term success. In conclusion, Guru Zhang as a wandering tiger. One might assume that after his return to the South and his subsequent establishment of a successful martial arts institute, Guru Zhang would settle down. Unfortunately, it was not to be. He left the region following the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. I have not been able to locate precise information on what he did next. In 1932, Ho Qian, a high official in Hebei province, hired Guru Zhang to act as a head instructor at the Hebei Military Academy. Such appointments were very prestigious and highly sought after. This kind of government sponsorship was seen as legitimating the efforts of a martial artist. Gu also opened a traditional medicine clinic in 1932, yet once again the master showed no interest in putting down his roots. In 1934, he returned to the South, this time to receive an appointment as the chief Guoshu instructor of the 8th Army. This would be the last major assignment of his career. In 1938, the Japanese invasion reached southern China. Most martial arts schools closed their doors or went underground. The Central Guoshu Institute retreated with the government to the far interior of the country. In the early 1940s, Guru Zhang announced his retirement from the world of the martial arts. At that point, he disappeared from public view. I have not been able to find much information on the final years of his life. He is known to have died in 1952, and a few of his students have asserted that heart problems were to blame. He was only 58 years old at the time of his death. His career spanned 3 decades, in which the traditional martial arts were transformed, modernized, and socially repositioned for even greater success in the future. Guru Zhang taught literally thousands of students in his lifetime. He played an important role in preserving and passing on China's martial culture. It is certainly interesting to watch how the Chinese martial arts evolved throughout his life. As a child, they were essential skills of bandits and paramilitary guards. Later, they fell on hard times. Then in the 1920s and 30s, the traditional combat systems were systematically reimagined as an aid in building and promoting a new vision of Chinese nationalism. Each of these shifts reflected larger changes in the China's economic and political situation. These in turn manifested themselves in very specific ways in Guru Zhang's life and career. That's the end of Ben's essay, and I spent several hours preparing for it, and I hope I shared it in a way that you could use it, re-listen to it over the time, or use it for some other projects. I did find one book called Tai Chi Chuan Theory and Practice. I'll put the links in the PDF, show notes, and on the webpage. And on Amazon it was written, quote, Paul Lam was a disciple of the late Master Leung Chi Chong. Leung Chi Chong, one of Grandmaster Guru Zhang's senior disciples. Leung was specialized in Tai Chi Chuan and wrote a book on Gu-style Tai Chi Chuan, endorsed by his teacher, called Tai Chi Chuan Shu, published in 1953. It is a rare book and has not been translated into English. Guru Zhang also wrote a book on his Tai Chi Chuan called Tai Chi Chuan, which was published in 1938, and is available in a reprinted format in Chinese. Both of these first and second generation books are historically significant and offer photographic representation of what these two masters were doing. However, Paul Tam's book covers virtually all of the same information and even includes excerpts from Gu's book, end quote, from Amazon. I put that in there so in case any of you would want to find it. And as always, thank you, Ben, for sharing your effort.
This is Kean Smith. I very much appreciate you listening to our program. Please subscribe or leave a review.
Thank you so much for joining us in episode 23, a look at Guru Zhang, a historical legend, as we explore the culture, the adventure, and impact of martial arts. This is your host, Sifu T.W. Smith, and I'm looking forward to starting 2015 with you.